Hello and welcome to this video on Lactobacillus, a bacteria that plays a major role in many day-to-day products and yet it gets very little appreciation or attention. Put another way, what does yogurt, sourdough, bread, kimchi, sauerkraut and kombucha have in common? Other than fermentation of different kinds, it is Lactobacillus. Lactobacillus is a kind of bacteria and it produces lactic acid from lactose, something that's kind of obvious from its name. Unlike yeast that makes both CO2 and ethanol, Lactobacillus primarily produces lactic acid. Unsurprisingly, for something called an acid, it is rather tart and therefore in most cases an undesirable taste. However, in certain situations or products, it can be exactly what you need. For example, in something like yogurt, where there's a large amount of lactose still, which is a sugar, the lactic acid counters this and creates a more balanced product. Lactobacillus, or Lactobacillus, as they are a larger group, are part of the gram-positive bacteria family. They're also obviously acid tolerant given what they produce. They don't create spores, but they are rod-shaped, and occasionally you may find them also as a sphere. The key to these is that, as a wide group, they all share the same common metabolic and physiological characteristics, primarily the use of lactose into lactic acid. More than anything else though, you might find them simply described as lactic acid bacteria, which, to be quite blunt, isn't the entire story, it's just a part of it. That's because there are, let's say, two main divisions. These divisions are based on the pathway for fermenting lactose. One is using glucose and a small amount of oxygen to create the lactic acid. These aren't as, let's say, exciting in terms of the products we're talking about, but they do exist. The second group are what are going to be trying to ferment your pentoses, something like pentose phosphoketoases. That's the pathway rather than the sugar itself. In very fundamental terms, you could divide the groups by the substrate that they use, one being the six-sided things like glucose, another being five-sided sugars. The products that come from this are, well, something like probiotics to start with. Probiotics as a pure product, so to say, but also something like, say, yogurt, which has what could be best described as beneficial bacteria, in that they're not going to cause a pathogenic infection as is, although to be clear, they can, they just need to be given the right opportunity. The other benefit to, probiotics is that most of the sugars within them are not digestible by the human body, but the bacteria within our GI tract certainly can. So rather than consuming it just for the bacteria, it's more accurate to say you're consuming it for the food within it for the bacteria already in your GI tract. We've already mentioned some of the foods that you can find it in. Think of things like yogurt, for instance. But there are a range of other, let's say, purposes it's included. Other than just making yogurt, it does contribute to both health and, to a certain degree, taste and odor. This is because the sugars within it, the range and diversity of sugars that are not digestible to the human body within these products are extreme, and as such, you can deliver a sort of booster to a lot of different bacteria within you. And because the human body can't digest it, we get some of the benefits of improving bacterial function. But that also comes with benefits for flavor and odor. It's why aromatic compounds in these are somewhat unique, let's say. Particularly if it gets to the point where it's gone what would be considered bad, although technically rotting in this case can be defined as the kind of fermentation we don't want. Other than taste and odor and the bacterial benefits, it can also change the texture. To be quite blunt about it, lactic acid within dairy products can lead to the sort of gelatinization of that foodstuff. It's why yogurt thickens somewhat, well, compared to milk anyway. A somewhat more, let's say, confrontational and arguably more hipster example would be something like kombucha, which is known to carry certain amounts of lactobacillus even in the finished product. It also makes a very, let's call it, unique flavor, although calling kombucha unique might be overly kind. In general terms, The process to go from, say, lactose to lactic acid is slightly more complex, and largely because it isn't necessarily made directly itself. Rather, it will vary considerably based on the substrate in use. We mentioned that there are two main groupings, and part of it is for this reason. First, you have the six-sided sugars, something like glucose. What you're going to have is glucose coming in, and then you get 2 ADP and 2 phosphates. And this leaves behind 2 lactates and 2 ATP molecules as a product of that reaction. You effectively break the glucose down into 2 lactates, 2 lactose molecules, although strictly speaking this isn't lactose itself, as that's a complete sugar. This has been metabolized. There is a second pathway, let's call it, and this is used by another kind of bacteria that's a part of the wider family. It's less efficient and effective, but it will produce more end products that can prove useful. Again, we start with glucose, and from here we have ADP, or adenosine diphosphate, and this is reacted with the glucose to create 1 phosphate extra. This leads to ATP. Along with ATP, you get lactose, ethanol, and CO2. And finally, the third pathway is the Bifidium pathway. This is where you have lactic acid fermentation, and it's perhaps the most effective way of producing ATP. It requires considerably more reagents going in, let's say. First, you have 2 glucose molecules, so considerably more in that respect. But you're also going to react this to get 5 ADP and 5 phosphates. This leads to the creation of 3 acetate molecules plus 2 lactates and 5 ATP. So you're getting more than twice as much ATP out of this, despite using only twice as much glucose. This is one reason why it's more effective and efficient. There is some questionable evidence for other benefits, particularly from using lactic acid bacteria for food production. The primary and very preliminary research says that lactic acid can be used by those who are lactose intolerant, and in effect act as a way of giving somebody who is lactose intolerant lactose-containing products without having to have any of the lactose present, or very little of it. As a result, it means that the bacteria minimize any issues the individual would have, and certainly intestinal distress they would encounter as a result. The caveat to this research is that it's primarily been evidenced in yogurt, rather than other products. Now, that does raise a number of questions, given that yogurt's not exactly a pure lactic acid bacteria culture, nor is it just lactobacillus, so any claims to that effect should be taken with a lot of salt. This, in short, is why lactic acid producing bacteria, and specifically lactobacillus, are underappreciated. What they do, and considering how well they do it, it's surprising they don't get more attention, although admittedly having everything taste like it's bitter and sour may not be desirable, which could explain some of the observed neglect. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.